set you right on my brain. Say about your love, thoughts a man insane. You broke my will, but what a thrill. Goodness gracious, great balls of fire. I love the love where my fire was fire. You came along and woo, man, I changed my mind. This love is fine. Goodness gracious, great balls of fire.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the University of Florida Literacy Institute webinar on the art of teaching reading, the art and science of teaching reading, focusing on struggling readers. My name is Marianne Ahern. I am with the Fiddler's Administration Project, and I am excited to have members of my team with us this morning, Sarah Gaines and Kim Seth, along with Dr. Holly Lane and her team, including Mindy Nissenberg, who have been our partners in bringing this to you this morning. We are so excited that so many of you have chosen to participate in this morning's webinar, and we know that you're going to get a great deal of information out of it. Just a few things we wanted to share with you as we get started this morning. This session is being recorded, and it's our goal to have it posted on our Fiddlers website. That's www.fdlrs.org website within 2 weeks of today's event. We are not using the cameras because there are so many of you joining us. We're afraid we would break the internet. So we're going to trust that you are fully engaged and smiling and enjoying your session with us this morning. We are going to be monitoring the chat constantly throughout today. So please make sure if you have questions or comments, you want to make an additional comment to your colleagues, feel free to use the chat. We are going to keep track of the questions that come in, and Dr. Lane and her team will be responding to them at an appropriate time when she can break during the presentation. We do have a break planned for you about midway through this morning. So trust us, stay tuned, stay focused, and we'll give you time for that extra cup of coffee when we get about halfway through. I want to take a moment and share my screen with you right now because I wanted to take you to our Fiddlers website. Hopefully you're seeing that on the screen right now. And so our fiddlers.org website is a combination of all of our network, our Fiddlers network. We've got 19 centers currently throughout the state that provide support services in the area of professional development, child find, we find the little ones in need of services, technology, and parent services. And so when you look at our network, you might think, well, how am I served by Fiddlers? Do I have access to Fiddlers? And you most certainly do. When you look at our website, if you go to the top of the panel here and you see Find a Center, if you click on that Find a Center, it will go to a feature which lets you look at your district. So let's say I'm from, I don't know, Orange County. Where's Orange County? Here we go. So I'm going to click on Orange County, and it's going to take me directly to a site that can't be reached. Isn't that just technology? Okay, so we'll go to a different one. If we wanted to go ahead and let's say we were from Putnam County and we wanted to go out to Putnam County, it would take us to the Fiddlers NEFEC in Putnam County that serves 7 districts in the surrounding area. So anybody can go ahead and at any time you can use the Find a Center feature and you can pull up your district and find your local center. I'm sharing this with you, and let me go back to the home page. You can do that simply by clicking on our icon up at the top. But I wanted to share that Find a Center with you because each one of our centers have a reading expert on staff who has gone through professional learning with Dr. Lane and her team to become very familiar with the UFLI website and resources that are going to be shared with you this morning. And so after our session today, you might have some additional questions, or you might be interested in obtaining professional learning for your school or your district in an area of differentiated instruction, exploring structured literacy, making reading instruction explicit, universal design for learning. So you can contact your local center. So I wanted to make sure you knew how to do that. If Sarah, if you'd please type in the chat our website once more, it's just www.fdlrs.org. And you click on that Find a Center and you can find the center that serves your area. So please take advantage of that. The only other thing I wanted to show you briefly is on our website, up in the top right corner, you see recorded webinars. We've been working throughout the past probably 1.5 to 2 years to provide a number of different webinars that are available for parents and for educators, and you'll see them posted on this page. Accommodations, behavior, instructional practices, social tales, emotional growth, how to address dyslexia. So there's a number of different resources that are available. And again, you simply go to the top right and that will take you to the recorded webinar session. And again, feel free to peruse our website at your convenience. Let me go ahead and stop sharing here. We are here to be of a support for you. We are a discretionary project of the Bureau of Exceptional Education and Exceptional Student Education, BESE, of the Florida Department of Education. And we are proud to serve all of Florida's districts and all of you. So without further ado, it is our honor to be collaborating with the brains at the University of Florida. Hopefully many of you have heard about the UFLI program, and Dr. Lane will be sharing that with you briefly. But we became aware of it probably a little over a year ago. And we're just taken back by the number of resources that are available and the wealth of information that's on the website. And so we had our reading specialists go through a training to be able to become familiar with it so that they could better assist you following today's webinar. And when Dr. Lane and Mindy and their team agreed to do a statewide offering on the art and science of teaching reading with a focus on struggling readers, we knew that this was a great partnership. So it is with extreme appreciation to Dr. Lane and Mindy and the team at the University of Florida for their willingness to collaborate with us. And we will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Lane to introduce her team and to get things going. Enjoy, everyone.
Hi all, thanks Marianne. And I welcome everyone this morning to our session, and I'm really excited that you all are here and that we're getting to share some of the things that we've been working with the FDLRS staff on reading and struggling readers and kids with dyslexia, so that they can follow up with you. So we have been preparing them to follow up this session and provide additional support. So you can certainly reach out directly to UFLI if you have questions after this session, but you can also consult your FDLRS reps. They will be prepared to help you as well. So let's go ahead and get started. We have a great team here ready to support you. My co-presenter this morning is Valentina Contess. And if you have spent any time on the UFLI Virtual Teaching Resource Hub, you have probably seen Valentina. There's lots of video of her in doing reading instruction and intervention, and she's a wonderful model of really high quality. We also have Mindy Nissenberg, as Marianne mentioned, and Kelly Taxier, who are going to be working behind the scenes to help answer questions. So just as a little bit of orientation to how we're doing the webinar today, you have a chat box, which a lot of you are already saying good morning and where you're from. That's great. We encourage you to continue that. And also, if you have any just general reactions or related ideas to share with your peers who are also watching, please feel free to put those kinds of things in the chat. If you have questions for your presenters, go ahead and put those in the Q&A. So if the Q&A will be specifically direct questions that you'd like for us to address. Can't promise that we'll get to all of them. Some of them we may be able to answer just through text if it is something more specific in your situation. If it's something that'll apply to the whole group, we'll try to get to that toward the end. And so we're going to let me go ahead and share my screen and what we are coming up with here. Okay, so I'll share a little bit about our agenda too, so you'll know where we are going to be headed this morning. So our session today is really about the science of reading and how it applies in particular to, as Marianne mentioned, struggling readers. So specifically, we're looking at kids with dyslexia, but really what we're talking about applies to any child who's struggling to learn to read and how we can provide effective intervention for those students. So if you're not familiar with the University of Florida Literacy Institute, the way that we define ourselves is really through our two main areas of work. So we do work in reader development. We provide some direct intervention services for kids, mostly through our teacher preparation programs. But also we study reading interventions for struggling readers. And we also do quite a bit of work in the area of teacher development. And really those things overlap quite a bit because our teacher development and reader development work happens together. Teachers learn best about readers when they're actually working with them. So we do a lot of work both in pre-service teacher development and in working with practicing teachers. So where those two things overlap is where we consider UFLI lives. So we will be sharing today a lot of the resources that are available on our website, but we're not going to get into great depth with that. So we encourage you to go and explore. There's a lot of information and a lot of resources there that you may find useful. So our agenda for today, the first part of the morning, we're going to be talking about the science of reading broadly. What does that mean? What is it telling us? A little bit about dyslexia and common misconceptions, both related to dyslexia and just to reading in general. Then we're going to take a short break and come back and get into methods, in particular methods for teaching kids to read words. So we're going to talk a little bit about word reading development broadly, and then how to teach kids to read little words, generally single syllable words, and then bigger words, multisyllabic words. And then we'll show you some of our tools for doing powerful word work. So let's go ahead and get started. Why is this important? Why do we care? Why does it matter so much? Well, overall, we're really not doing a very good job making sure all our kids can read. Nationally, this is through the National Assessment of Educational Progress. We know that only about 35% of our students by fourth grade have reached proficient levels of reading. And that means about 2/3 of kids are not reading proficiently. And about 1/3 of them are not even reading at the basic level. So that's a really huge issue. But it gets even a little bit more depressing because when we start to look at the subgroups, it's even fewer kids. So 23% of Hispanic students, only about 21% of students who are eligible for the National School Lunch Program, only 18% of Black students, only 12% of students with disabilities, and only 10% of ELLs reach reading proficiency by fourth grade. So the vast majority of kids are not getting what they are needing. And so this is why we're here. We want to help you understand more about what your struggling readers need and how you can support them. So what we're going to be drawing on is this broad concept of the science of reading. And the science of reading, those words, the science of reading, have become kind of a buzzword in education now. And that always worries me because buzzwords tend to get misunderstood and misapplied and misinterpreted. So what I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking about what the science of reading actually is and a little bit about what it's not, and help you understand how it can inform your practice as teachers. So to begin with, when we talk about the science of reading, as educators, we're most familiar with the research that comes out of our field, education. So really, when we're talking about science, we're talking about research. And so most of the research that you're most familiar with likely comes from education. So this includes research on pedagogy, things like instructional methods, instructional materials. There's research on teacher knowledge, what teachers need to know and be able to do. There's a lot of research on student outcomes, like the NAEP results I just shared with you. That's from the field of education. That's the information that we're getting about reading. And so what's important to understand is this body of research is really focused on the methods and materials that may or may not give us as much information as we need. One of the big sources of information related to this is the National Reading Panel. And the National Reading Panel actually expanded beyond just education research, but that was where it really focused. And the National Reading Panel, it was 21 years ago, believe it or not, that this came out. And most teachers today are familiar with at least the basics here. So if in 1999, before the National Reading Panel report came out, if you asked 10 teachers, what are the essential elements of reading, you'd probably get 10 completely different answers. After the National Reading Panel report came out, if you ask 10 teachers, probably at least 9 of them will tell you that reading is phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Okay, the Fab Five, right? The 5 pillars of reading. And that's great. It's great that we had completely different understandings and now we have a shared understanding. But there's a problem in that that shared understanding is not really accurate. Yes, all of these things are essential elements of reading, but the way that they're often portrayed like this, as these 5 pillars of reading, is not how they're connected. And it doesn't show that these things are related to each other. It also places comprehension just over here, as one of these 5 things, when in reality, comprehension is the reason that we read. It's the thing that everything else on here is intended to produce. So that's an important thing to consider, is that phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, and vocabulary all serve comprehension. And that's really not depicted in the way that it's usually talked about. So this is one element of education research that is both useful, but also somewhat limited in its utility. The way that we talk about this at UFLI is a little bit different. We have a different conceptualization of reading, and it's certainly not as sleek and simple and elegant as the 5 pillars in that way, but it is actually a lot more accurate. This places reading comprehension at the center, and everything else influences. And there's more than those other 4 elements that influence it. And the way that these things are grouped is important. So phonemic awareness influences decoding, and decoding influences fluency, and fluency influences comprehension. That connection is an important one to understand. It's also important to understand that there are features beyond those Fab 5, things like knowledge. Your background knowledge about a topic is one of the key determiners of how well you will understand a passage related to that topic. What you already know will determine what you will learn from reading that passage. So there's other aspects, and even this conceptualization doesn't include everything. There are things like working memory that is not related here, is not depicted here. But this isn't exhaustive, but it's a lot more complete. And I think that's important to understand, that there's more to reading than just the Fab 5. Other elements in this body of education research, though, really focus on, can get very specific with the types of materials and methods that we use, what kind of grouping strategies might be effective, what kind of text might be useful. This was the body of research that has generated our understanding about multi-tiered systems of support, and really also helps us understand the outcomes for kids who are struggling. So education research is certainly important, and it's given us a lot of information, but the important thing to understand is that it's only one piece of a puzzle. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot more to the science of reading than just education research. One of the most important fields that has contributed quite a bit to our understanding of reading is psychology. So psychology, when I say psychology here, I'm talking mostly about cognitive psychology and developmental psychology, but also school psychology and other branches of the field. In general, psychology is the study of thinking and learning. And so this is the body of research that helps us understand things like memory and attention, and other mental processes like perception and problem solving. And so out of this body of research, we get a lot of information about how people learn, which should be really critical foundational knowledge for teachers in understanding then how to teach. So in this area, just how to take information from someone else and organize it in your own mind, how to store information, how to organize it, how to understand where to file things in your understanding, and how to retrieve the information that you need. Things like cognitive load theory. This is all coming out of psychology. So in relation to reading, how this relates is the idea that you need to be very proficient in very basic skills in order to have the cognitive load or the working memory capacity to devote to the more complex skills like comprehension. So reading words, reading text is the red here. And if I'm really proficient at reading words, then I have lots of cognitive effort available to devote to understanding. If I'm not proficient at reading words, then my energy is going to have to focus on figuring out what the heck the author is saying so that I can understand the meaning of it. So the more proficient I am at reading words, the better I am at comprehending. And so we'll hear things like, focusing so much on decoding takes away attention from comprehension, when actually the opposite is true. The more proficient we can get our kids at reading words, the better comprehenders they will be. Another finding out of the field of psychology is this idea of practice and how practice can be best organized to optimize learning. So one element or one type of practice is blocked practice. And this is the idea that I teach a skill and I practice it until I master it. And then I go on to another skill and I practice that until I master it. And then I go on to another skill and I practice it until I master it. So a real common application of blocked practice would be our weekly spelling lists. We give kids a list of words on Monday. They practice them all week. They write them in ABC order. They write them 5 times each. They do all this practice, and then they take a test on Friday and they get 100%. And then on the next Monday, they get another list of words. But deep down, even though you may be doing that kind of practice, you know that if a month later you gave them an old spelling test again, the same kids who got 100 would probably get 30 or 40% right? So that kind of practice doesn't necessarily lead to the kind of retention that we need for reading skills. Another way to do this is what's called interleaved practice. In interleaved practice, you learn a skill and you practice it some, and then you move on to another skill and learn it and practice it some. But you come back and you keep practicing over time the original skill, and you're interleaving the practice of these different skills. Now, for learning things that are unrelated to each other, blocked practice actually makes a difference, and that can be more appropriate. But for learning skills that are very closely related, things like applying letter sound correspondences in different kinds of words, interleaved practice has been shown to be more effective. So this is a finding from psychology research that a lot of teachers don't know. And so it's important when we think about the science of reading, we look more broadly beyond education into fields like psychology. So psychology isn't the only other piece of the puzzle. There's still more. Another field that's contributed quite a bit to our understanding of reading is the area of linguistics. So just like if you are teaching, say, high school calculus, you probably ought to know math really well, right? If you're teaching high school chemistry, you should probably understand chemistry really well. Well, if you're teaching reading, what you're teaching, the content of what you're teaching is language. You're teaching written language, how to access written language. And the content comes from linguistics. And unfortunately, most teacher preparation programs don't have a whole lot of information about linguistics in them in order to prepare teachers to be content experts in the content that they're teaching. A lot of us just think of well, I am a good reader, so I should be able to teach reading. But if you don't understand linguistics, you're probably not going to be able to be an expert reading teacher. So linguistics is really the study of language structure. So this includes things like semantics, the meanings of words and the meanings of sentences and the meanings of connected text. Syntax, so understanding the grammatical aspects of language or the sentence order, how things are structured really has a big influence on understanding it. Knowing about morphology and word meanings and the meanings of word parts and how changing a part of a word can change the meaning of the whole word. Phonology, understanding the sound structure of our language and how that can process. And then phonetics, understanding how those sounds are produced. All of those things contribute to understanding reading. So this includes also understanding things like oral language and how the development of oral language contributes to reading comprehension. Understanding how word parts can be combined. This is the morphology aspect I mentioned. Understanding sentence structures and parts of speech and how sentences are created, but also things like the order of the words. So knowing the cat chased the mouse means one thing, but if I just change the order of the word and say the mouse chased the cat, it means something entirely different. Those things seem obvious to us, but for a beginning reader, those may not be as obvious. And this is a pretty simple version of word order, but sometimes it can be a little bit more complex, and understanding how syntax influences meaning is really important. Also understanding the phonetics, so understanding how this can be applied in decoding is critically important. There's a lot to be said for knowing what's going on with your vocal structure during speech and how that relates to the letters or graphemes on the page. So linguistics has contributed quite a bit to our understanding of reading. The last field that I will talk about, and there are other fields that contribute in some ways, but these are the four major ones. The last field that I'll mention is the field of neuroscience. So neuroscience is the study of the human brain, and this includes both the brain structure and function. And in particular, we're looking at things like the patterns of activation during activities such as reading and how the brain develops over time. So neuroscience is not as directly related to instruction as the other areas, but it's important for us to understand how the brain processes information during reading, because a lot of methods of instruction don't really promote the kinds of brain activation patterns that we would want. So the idea that while we are reading, we are activating certain areas of our brain is really important. So this is primarily happening on the left hemisphere. And this is what a typical skilled reader's brain looks like in terms of the activation patterns. So the occipital-temporal area is processing the visual information. You see the letters on the page and you start noticing that's a letter, that's just a squiggly line, and knowing the difference, knowing the letters from the pictures and so forth. And you process that information and you're storing that information. The inferior frontal gyrus processes the sound. So this area is known as Broca's area. And in Broca's area, we're processing the speech sounds that are connected to the letters. And then in the parietotemporal area, this is where the sounds and the letters get connected. And so all three of these areas get activated during reading for a skilled reader. So if we think of this as the skilled reader, we can look over here at the dyslexic reader, okay? So the brain activation patterns of someone with dyslexia look very different from the brain activation patterns of a skilled reader. And that distinction is important because what's happening is sometimes the Broca's area is even overactivated because they're really struggling to process the sound part. And there's not enough efficiency in connecting the letters and sounds together. So what happens is the reading process becomes much more difficult because all of the right areas of the brain aren't activated. But what's kind of cool is that there have been studies that show with effective intervention, the brain activation patterns of a dyslexic reader can end up looking very much like the brain activation patterns of a skilled reader when they are doing the right kinds of connections. So the other difference that I think is worthwhile, and this just for anyone who, for example, thinks that dyslexia is not real, there are actually structural differences as well. So in a couple of different parts of the brain in particular, Heschel's gyrus and the planum temporale in particular, and I'm not going to pretend to really know this stuff, but one thing that I do understand is that in typical readers, the planum temporale is naturally asymmetrical. So one side, on one hemisphere, the planum temporale is typically larger than on the other hemisphere. In dyslexic readers, there's either symmetry, they're the same size, or the opposite asymmetry. And so this is the kind of thing that, we're not going to ever, at least in our lifetimes probably, be doing MRIs on kids who are struggling in school. But just knowing that there are, in fact, structural differences that likely lead to different patterns of activation, help us understand that this is something real and something that we need to address. So these are the 4 areas of, or 4 fields that contribute most largely to the body of research that we call the science of reading. And so when you hear that term, I don't want you to think of a particular instructional method or one thing in particular, but I want you to think about the fact that there is a lot of evidence about how kids read, how people read in general, but how kids learn to read. And there's a lot of evidence about methods of reading instruction that are more or less effective. When I mentioned, for example, the neuroscience piece of this, looking at brain activation patterns, some methods really can promote the right kinds of activation patterns, wherein kids who have been learning in other methods, a lot of the activity is in the right hemisphere, where most reading activity ought to be in the left hemisphere. So there are a lot of things that we need to understand about how our reading instruction aligns with what we know from these different fields of research. So this little explanation of the science of reading, I did a little video about this. So if you are interested in hearing any of this, again, there's a YouTube video, and my colleagues will put the link in the chat for you. Just if you wanted to share this particular information. It's a very short summary of it. So a little bit more about the research that goes into reading. You may have heard of this particular theory of reading development called the simple view of reading. And if not, I hope that you'll listen carefully, because this is a really important thing to understand. There's been a lot of research testing out this theory, and it has held up for 30 years now. There's a lot of explanations for why we think that this is appropriate, but I just want you to understand that this is something that's worth knowing about as a teacher. So the simple view of reading can be stated very simply. It doesn't mean it is a simple idea. It just means that it can be stated very, very simply. And that is that reading comprehension is the product of decoding and linguistic comprehension. And the word product is italicized there because I want to emphasize that. It's specifically stated as a product because it can be depicted as a mathematical formula. It's a little multiplication problem here. Okay, so decoding times linguistic comprehension equals reading comprehension. So let's break this down a little bit. Reading comprehension is the product, okay? So it's the outcome of combining these two other skills in a really important way. And it's multiplied in that you can't just have one and not the other. You've got to have both because one affects the other. So mathematically, think about that. If both are missing, if you don't have decoding or linguistic comprehension skills, you'll have zero reading comprehension skill. But even if they're both developed and you have full comprehension, even if one is missing, then reading comprehension will be missing. You can have great decoding skills, decode any word that's presented to you, but if you don't have good linguistic comprehension, you're not going to be able to understand what you're reading. You might be able to decode the words, but it's not going to result in reading comprehension. And the reverse is also true. If you have zero decoding skills, it doesn't matter that you've got great language comprehension. If you can't read the words, you won't have good reading comprehension. Both are important and pretty equally so. If one is weak, then reading comprehension will be weak. You can't have better reading comprehension than either one of these things, right? So if decoding is only half developed, you won't get better than half developed reading comprehension. Okay. And if both of them are weak, reading comprehension is even weaker. So keep this in mind, that this idea of reading comprehension is a product. It's the outcome of well-developed skills in the areas of decoding and linguistic comprehension. So you may have also seen this portrayed as a metaphor of a rope. This was from Hollis Scarborough, and I think it's a really elegant way of thinking about it. She didn't build it specifically on the simple view of reading, but it aligns beautifully with it. So she has these two big strands: language comprehension and word recognition. So linguistic comprehension, decoding, right? Those are pretty parallel to the simple view. And in linguistic comprehension, she's got background knowledge, so what you already know about a topic; vocabulary knowledge, your understanding of word meanings; language structures, your understanding of how syntax or word order conveys meaning; your overall verbal reasoning. So this you can think of as basically your verbal IQ, right? Your innate ability in the area of verbal skills. And then literacy knowledge, which specifically focuses on your understanding of how print works. So that there are different text structures, you have different genres of text, and so forth. And then you have word recognition, which includes phonological awareness, decoding skills, and sight recognition. And the way that this metaphor works is that these are sort of separate ideas early on in development, but over time, linguistic comprehension skills become increasingly strategic as they get woven together more tightly. Also, over time, word recognition skills become increasingly automatic as they get practiced over time. And as these two big strands get woven together and then woven with each other, you eventually have a really nice tight rope, right? And that's where we end up with skilled reading. So fluent execution of all of these different skills that result in comprehension of text. So back to the simple view and how this all relates together. If you do an assessment and you find out that a child struggles in reading comprehension, you need to know what to do to help solve that problem, right? So one of the things that's very, very common is that with a problem related to reading comprehension, let's just focus on developing comprehension strategies. And that's almost never the right solution. What we need to look at is where on the other side of the equation, what's going wrong and what do we need to solve that? So if it's in the decoding area, we would want to do some follow-up assessments. We would want to say, well, let's see how their text level automaticity is. They struggle in comprehension. Let's give them an oral reading fluency passage, 1 minute timing, see how they do. If they reached benchmark for their grade level with text level automaticity, then we know the decoding side of the equation is not the problem. The problem is on the language comprehension. But if text level automaticity is not at benchmark, we want to dig deeper. We want to look for word level automaticity. Are they good at automatically reading words? If that's good, then we'll want to just focus on developing text level automaticity. If it's a problem, we want to dig deeper. We want to look at decoding accuracy. So it's not enough to be accurate. You also have to be automatic, but you have to be accurate before you can become automatic. So if I'm struggling with word level automaticity, I want my decoding accuracy assessed to see if that's where the problem lies. If that's okay, then we move back to word level automaticity and build that. If that's a problem, let's dig deeper and say, how's the phonemic awareness in this particular case? If that's good, then we're going to focus on decoding accuracy. See how you just go down this list? And the other side, we also have things we can assess. We can look at vocabulary. We can look at background knowledge. We can look at language structures or understanding of syntax, and we can look at verbal reasoning. So on the decoding side, these things are hierarchical. You would start at the text level automaticity and dig deeper, move down that list. On the language comprehension side, these are not hierarchical. These are separate constructs that you would need to measure each one to figure where the language comprehension difficulties lie. And they are ordered in what I would consider the easiest to assess and the easiest to remediate. Vocabulary of these is the most concrete. You can assess vocabulary pretty readily, and if it's a problem, there's lots of intervention you can apply to develop vocabulary knowledge. Background knowledge and language structures are both a little bit trickier, both to assess and to intervene. And then verbal reasoning as an individual's overall verbal skills is the hardest area to affect any kind of change in. But the decoding side is a little bit more straightforward. And the good news is for kids who struggle in reading comprehension, the bulk of those students, their difficulties are on the decoding side of the equation. About 70% of kids who struggle with reading comprehension have decoding or word level difficulties. Only. I should preface that they have only word level and no language comprehension difficulties. About 10% have only language comprehension problems and no decoding problems. Okay, there's about 20% that have problems in both areas, and those are likely to be the kids with the most significant reading difficulties. So if we look at the 70% that's only word level difficulties plus the 20% that has both, that means 90% of kids who struggle with reading comprehension have problems with word reading. And only 10% have just language comprehension, and only 30% have language comprehension as a component of their difficulty. So a lot of times I'll hear that the simple view of reading is all about phonics. Well, it's not, but for struggling readers, that's most often where the problem lies. So that's why those two things get connected quite a bit. So just a little bit about effective instruction before we get into more specific methods. I want to just talk to you a little bit about effective instruction broadly. So we think of effective instruction in reading being explicit and systematic. So explicit is just very clear and unambiguous explanations of concepts. Systematic means that I have carefully sequenced the skills that I'm teaching, and that's the skill progression is logical from easier to more difficult. I have to know this before I learn that, and so on, and that it's organized in what we would consider manageable steps. Effective instruction should also include several features. So one is lots and lots of opportunities to respond. So we want to make sure that each student in our class has multiple opportunities to practice every new skill or concept that you're teaching. We also want to make sure that we're providing feedback. If they get something correct, we want to provide behavior-specific praise so that they know what they did was right, and that will help them do that more. We also want to provide corrective feedback when they make an error. So if they get something wrong, that we very neutrally provide them with the correct way to do that particular skill or concept. So these are things that are true of effective instruction across the board, but particularly for reading instruction. When we talk about effective intervention in reading, we're talking about the same things. It's explicit and it's systematic. But the thing that distinguishes intervention from instruction is that it's more intensive. Reading intervention should be longer. You should spend more time. You might need an extra 20 or 30 minutes with the kids who need intervention. Because it's longer, you have more opportunities to respond, more opportunities for practice, and that it's generally delivered in smaller groups. So you might have a small group or even one-on-one tutoring for intervention. It also includes all of the other features of effective instruction. But it's important to understand that the major thing that distinguishes effective intervention from instruction is its intensity, how much kids are getting, how many opportunities to practice that they get. The rest of it should look very much the same. So one way to think about this, I like this way to depict this. We think about the idea of opportunities to respond as part of a gradual release of responsibility. So in tier 1, we typically think of an I do, we do, you do. I model it and demonstrate it. We practice it together. We do guided practice, and then you do independent practice. But because we know how important practice and opportunities to respond are, we're going to increase those opportunities to respond, a little bit more guided practice before we expect kids to do it independently. That's how we can beef up our tier 1 and have fewer kids needing tier 2, is increasing the opportunities to practice. Because we're in the South, we're also going to add in there a y'all do, right? So it's not just I do, we do, you do, it's I do, we do, y'all do, you do. And the distinction there is I do it is modeling and demonstration. We do it is we're all going to do it together. I'm going to help you. I'm going to be part of that guided practice. Y'all do it is I'm going to pair you up or put you in small groups to practice it before I ask you to do it all by yourself. So that's an important step that you can use to enhance that opportunities to respond. In tier 2, we're just going to have more of all of that because we're increasing intensity, more opportunities to practice, I might demonstrate it more than once. We might practice it together multiple times. And in tier 3, it's just more of each. The opportunities to practice is the main difference in intervention. So we're going to shift gears a little bit now, and I want to talk to you a little bit about dyslexia and how these things apply. And then we're going to start talking about some misconceptions, because there are a lot of misconceptions related to dyslexia and just about reading in general. So we have at the UFLI website some resources. If you click on the resources link, you'll see a dyslexia resource hub. And on that hub, you'll have all sorts of information about dyslexia, policy, professional development, resources, and organizations. So if you click on the information about dyslexia, there's a whole long list of items, but you'll see these, including the definitions. Even the definition of dyslexia is a little bit confusing. And so we have a handout that shows the different definitions that currently exist and how they're used, where they're used, who uses them. So this is a PDF you can download on the site. We also have some information about dyslexia policy. And so if you're interested in what state or federal policy says about dyslexia, what you can and can't do, what kind of diagnosis you need for what kind of intervention and so forth, that's the link for you. We have one on professional development. And for professional development, we have a variety of resources, but I'm going to give a shameless plug to the UF graduate certificate in dyslexia. So we are currently accepting applications if you're interested in this. It's a 5-course sequence designed to prepare teachers for work in effective assessment and intervention in dyslexia. And we also have a whole lot of outside or external resources and organizations listed here for different purposes. So we encourage you to go and explore some of these other resources, including Fiddler's right there. So rather than get into a whole lot of the explanation, I also want to just go back to the information about dyslexia tab. We have this section here on dyslexia myths and facts, and there is a handout, if you go there, that's the dyslexia myths and facts handout, and on there, there's an explanation about what dyslexia is, some of the common myths related to dyslexia, how dyslexia manifests over time, over the lifespan, and information about effective intervention. And we're going to address a lot of these today, but this is also another handout that you can download and use and refer back to. So with this idea of the myths and facts about dyslexia, I think this is a good time for us to just talk about how the science of reading can be used to combat myths or misconceptions about reading and in general and about dyslexia specifically. So for the next few minutes, I just want to share some common misconceptions and then the science behind those that we can say, well, this is what science tells us. Okay. So for each one, I'm going to list a common misconception and then what the science tells us. So the first common misconception is that learning to read is natural and it's just like learning to talk. And that's not true. Humans have been speaking for over 100,000 years. And because of that, we have fully evolved to process language. And every group of humans on the planet, whether they do anything with written language or not, every group of humans has some spoken language that they use and understand. That is hardwired. That is natural. Learning to read is not. Humans only started reading using alphabetic systems about 3,000 years ago, which sounds like, well, 3,000 years, that's a really long time, right? But evolutionarily speaking, it's just a tiny, tiny drop in the bucket. Our brains have not had time to truly adapt to using alphabetic systems. And so we actually have only become very literate as a world population in the last 60 or 70 years. So one of the things that we know for sure, it's very, very clear, is that learning to read for the vast majority of people requires instruction. And yes, some people will pick up on it easier than others, just like any skill. Some people can sit down and learn how to play a piano really easily without any instruction, but they're rare. Most people need at least some instruction. And again, some people will pick up on it easier. For some people, they may try and struggle no matter what. Same thing happens with reading. But the vast majority, 90-something% of kids will need at least some instruction to learn to read. And I like this quote by Keith Stanovich: the idea that learning to read is just like learning to speak is accepted by no responsible linguist, psychologist, or cognitive scientist in the research community. Nobody believes that who knows things. So if you hear somebody say that it's a natural process, you can explain that they're wrong and the science goes completely against that. Another common misconception about dyslexia is that it's a problem with how someone sees letters or words. Okay, so confusing and seeing B differently than they see D, right? Seeing was as saw. Sometimes I'll hear about, words dancing around on the page or blurry text. What the science tells us is that people with dyslexia see things just like everyone else. So seeing things differently or printing things differently is just something that all kids do. The writing a B for a D, that's just typical because it's the first time in a child's life that the orientation in space of an object changes its identity. If you say this is a pen and this is a pen and this is a pen, but if I have it this way, it's a B and this way it's a D, that is confusing, right? And that's just an early stage of literacy development. And people with dyslexia tend to be at the early stage of literacy development longer. That's the only reason you see kids with dyslexia making those reversals longer. But the fact that there is some vision issue is just not true. Now, people with dyslexia have differences in visual acuity, just like the rest of us. So there may be a vision problem, but it just has nothing to do with their dyslexia. So dyslexia instead is a problem with how someone processes the sounds in spoken language. Okay, so how we process what goes in our ears, how that gets processed in our brain, and how we connect those sounds with letters, as if you remember that from the brain image earlier. So one of the things to know is that as we are processing, we're doing something called orthographic mapping. This idea that we're connecting letters and sounds to then be able to pronounce the word. That process is what's critical. And people with dyslexia do tend to struggle with that process more than typically developing readers. But interventions like colored overlays or special lenses for people with dyslexia are not supported by science. In fact, there's a lot of research that shows that they make no difference. Same kind of thing with special fonts. There's lots of things like that are marketed. If it has to do with vision and dyslexia, ignore it, because dyslexia is not a problem with how someone sees letters or words. Another common misconception is that dyslexia and SLD in reading are two separate things. They're not, they're the same thing. What we know is that dyslexia actually is a specific learning disability in word level reading skills. This graph shows all of the different disabilities that are recognized by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and SLD in basic reading skills is one of them. And there is actual federal guidance out there, and you can find this on our Dyslexia Hub, that tells us that, yes, you can use the term dyslexia, and you really should, because it helps clarify things. We hear sometimes that dyslexia needs to be a medical diagnosis. That's absolute nonsense. There's very few pediatricians out there that have any idea how to recognize dyslexia. Dyslexia is an educational problem. And one of my colleagues uses this analogy: dyslexia and SLD is like H2O in water. You can use a different term, but you're talking about the same thing. So when we're talking about intervention for kids with dyslexia, we're talking about the same kinds of interventions for anybody who's struggling. It's explicit and systematic, and it's going to be more intensive. These things are very well established in the research literature. There's another thing that some experts will support and others not so much, and that's whether it needs to be multisensory. So we hear a lot about intervention for kids with dyslexia has to be multisensory, and it's usually not the way that we think about it. Things like writing on sandpaper and things like that, those kinds of multisensory activities really don't have a robust research base to them. The way that the thing that does have a robust research base is multisensory at a more micro level, looking at what's going on in your vocal tract when you're producing sounds. That actually does have research to support it. So if you're defining multisensory that way, yes, that's true. But a lot of the things done in the name of multisensory intervention really aren't going to make a substantial difference. If your intervention is explicit, systematic, and intensive, it's likely to be effective. Those other kinds of multisensory things don't necessarily have much impact. And even how you're defining multisensory, if the multisensory activity is forming a letter on sandpaper, you're actually practicing a literacy skill that is helpful. You're practicing forming a letter. That's the part that's important there. The fact that it's on sandpaper doesn't matter so much. I've heard some crazy things being used in the name of multisensory intervention. I had my kids writing with a scented marker to activate their olfactory sense. Like, that's nonsense. That's absolute garbage. So be careful when you hear about those kinds of multisensory interventions. Another common misconception is that phonemes are the sounds we hear in words. And this one is actually not wrong. It's just incomplete. In education, remember we talked about using different bodies of research. In education, we typically define a phoneme as the smallest unit of sound in spoken language, which it is, but that's not all it is. In linguistics, if we're really trying to understand the language well, linguists consider a phoneme both the sound that's produced and the physical act used to produce that sound. Okay, a phoneme is both the sound we hear and the physical act that produces that sound. Okay, so you can look at these pictures of mouths and figure out, or at least narrow way down, what sound is being produced. When I have my lips together, that could only be an or a b or a p, right? There's only a few things that it could possibly be. The next one could only be a ch or a sh or a j or a j. Those are the only things that are produced that way. And being aware of how sounds are produced is what it means to be phonemically aware. It's not just aware of the sounds themselves, but how those sounds are produced. So phonemic awareness is understanding that attention to the articulatory gestures that are used to produce sounds. So common misconceptions about phonological awareness more broadly. A lot of people will swear that phonological awareness instruction needs to begin with syllables and rhyming and gradually progress to phonemes, and that phonological awareness should not include letters. These are all misconceptions. So let me just explain very quickly what I mean by that. Phonological awareness does not need to gradually progress to phonemes. You can begin at the phoneme level, even in preschool. Now, for some kids, that's a pretty abstract idea, attending to individual phonemes, and you can use larger units of sound to just sensitize them to thinking about language separate from its meaning. But it's not essential to go through the process of teaching rhyming and syllable level work in order to get them to the phoneme level. In fact, that work has been shown to really not have an effect on the development of phonemic awareness. So you can begin right from the beginning with work at the phoneme level, and you should. You should also, this other common misconception that phonological awareness should not include letters, and I think this comes from how we have tried to talk to teachers and help them understand the distinctions between phonological awareness and phonics, that phonics is when you add letters, and phonological awareness, you probably have heard, phonological awareness instruction can be done in the dark. Well, just because it can be doesn't mean that it should be. And using letters in our phonological awareness instruction actually makes it more effective. And we've known this for years. The National Reading Panel report that came out in 2000 told us that including letters makes our phonological awareness instruction more effective. So as soon as kids know a couple of letters and their sounds, you can start combining those and using phonics instruction to develop phonemic awareness. And those two skills are reciprocal. So if I know the sound for ah and t, then I can blend those together and get at. And then I can add a sound at the beginning and get sat. And then I can change out the vowel sound and say sit. And then I can change other sounds, right? And so I can make new words from the very beginning. As soon as I know a few letters and sounds, I can start to combine my phonemic awareness and phonics instruction. You can do phonics instruction with the goal of developing phonemic awareness. Another common misconception, and we touched on this earlier, is that focusing on decoding draws students' attention away from comprehension when the opposite is actually true. The more proficient we can get kids with decoding through sufficient practice, the more likely that they will be good comprehenders. The idea that skilled readers use many different strategies to figure out words. Skilled readers decode words, and they do it really proficiently. To read a word you need to recognize each grapheme in the word. You need to produce the associated phoneme. The grapheme-phoneme correspondences are really important. And then you need to blend those phonemes together. That's how skilled readers read words. This requires that you know your letter sounds, that you know that you have phonemic awareness so you can blend sounds, and you have an understanding of the alphabetic principle, that idea that letters and sounds can be, that they work together in systematic ways to form words. So this leads me to the idea that any strategy that requires a reader to take their eyes off the word is actually likely to interfere with efficient processing of the word. You may have seen these. This is on posters and bookmarks and you name it. It's all around. I see this in classrooms all the time. And these are strategies, most of which are not good strategies to teach. Eagle eye, look at the picture. Think, what is in the picture that starts with the beginning letter? So let's not decode the word. Let's look at the first letter and then look at the picture and guess. That's not reading words, that's fake reading words. And so of all of these strategies, there's really only one that I think is really a solid strategy to teach. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ones that are not. So this is generally something, if you have this, I would toss it. It's not a good set of strategies to teach. Skilled readers look at the letters, they put the sounds of those letters together. And the more automatic you become with that process, the more proficient you are as a reader. Another common misconception is that high frequency words should be memorized by sight. And this comes from a lot of misunderstanding about what the concept of sight words is. All words are sight words to proficient readers. When you read as a proficient reader, you don't have to think and decode through most of the words. The vast majority of words you just recognize instantly by sight, even if you haven't seen the word before. Generally, you can really read it instantly. And that's because you have developed phoneme grapheme correspondences so solidly. So a sight word is any word that a reader can read or recognize instantly without having to think about it. So the process used to secure words in long-term memory is a process called orthographic mapping. So this is the process by which you see a letter, you connect it with a sound, and sometimes you see a combination of letters like the SH in fish and connect it with the sound. So the orthographic mapping it's a mental process. It's not a skill that you watch. It's a process that's going on inside your head that connects the sounds, the phonemes, to their spellings, the graphemes. And doing this enough, having enough opportunities for practicing those connections, that's what allows words to be secured in long-term memory. For typically developing readers, you can secure that word in long-term memory with as few as 1 to 4 exposures. For kids with dyslexia, it might take 20 or even way more than that exposures to a word before it's secured in long-term memory to get those parts of the brain connecting and working together. Another common misconception is that learning the shape of words is helpful. If we're attending to individual phoneme grapheme correspondences, we're not looking at words as a visual unit. So word shape, you've seen this, you may have done this. I did this as a teacher. We've all probably learned this at some point as something that was supposedly useful. It's actually detrimental because what it's doing is taking kids' attention away from the individual letter sounds and trying to look at a word as a shape when there are hundreds of words that have 3 small letters followed by a tall letter. I mean, that knowing that shape is not what is helpful. So what the science is telling us is that skilled readers do not process words as visual units like this. So doing that is not helpful. What skilled readers do is orthographic mapping, connecting letters and sounds to get the pronunciation. The left side is the process of decoding. I see the word, I connect it with its sounds, I combine those sounds to get the word. The right one is encoding or spelling. I want to say the word and then, okay, I have to segment it into its individual sounds and then attach a grapheme to each of those phonemes. So one example of evidence of this is looking at the word bear. Okay, here's the shape of bear, a tall letter followed by 3 short letters. Helpful. Well, bear is in a lot of early reading books. But what we've seen is that kids, once they have secured the word bear in their memory through orthographic processing, you can show them this and they get it instantly. This word, same word, but it looks completely different. It's not the same overall shape. It's not a tall letter followed by 3 short letters. Every letter is tall. Every letter is a different shape than in the lowercase. But kids who have learned the top word recognize the bottom word instantaneously, which is just more evidence that we are not processing it as a visual unit. In fact, kids who can recognize that top one can recognize any of these pretty quickly. So there's a lot of information that I've just shared with you. And what I want you to take from this first section is that it's okay if you don't know it. And if you're using some of these strategies that I've associated with some of the misconceptions, now you can stop. We do the best we can until we know better. And then when we know better, we do better. I love this quote because I really want this to be kind of a no shame zone, right? If you didn't know some of this, now you know it, and you can start thinking about how you can change your practice to align with this. So I'm going to take just a really short moment to answer some questions. And Valentina, do you have questions from the Q&A that are applicable to the group?
Yes, a few things have come up and lots of engagement in the chat. So thank you all for that. One of the questions that just recently came in is, do I understand that high frequency word lists are not as helpful as many think? So could you speak a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yes, I would say that that is true. So high frequency words do need to be learned, but learning them as visual units is the thing that is not helpful. So most high frequency words can be decoded. Had, very high frequency word, I can decode. Had, right? So the vast majority can be completely decoded. In the second part of our session, we'll talk about words that are irregular high frequency words like said, that require a little bit different approach. So focusing in on teaching the irregular words slightly differently than we teach the regular high frequency words. What we don't want to do is just start drilling kids on flashcards from the beginning. That's not efficient. We want to teach kids how to decode words. Even irregular words can be decoded most of the way. And we will get into that in the second part of our session.
Yes, thank you for mentioning. There was another specific question about irregular words, so I'm glad you mentioned that. And then there's a few others, but this one, because of the misconceptions I wanted to share with you, someone brought up that the state frequently talks about this multisensory layer, like the sandpaper. So she asked about specific collaboration to ensure that we are communicating the evidence throughout the state and to educate.
Right, and there is actually, it's in statute that we use multisensory instruction. And if we are defining multisensory as attending to articulatory gestures, then I fully support that. And the research, the science fully supports that. The other pieces, the other methods of multisensory, those just don't have the research support. So it's really not that there's anything wrong with multisensory, it's how we are understanding what multisensory instruction is and what it should be. A lot of the practices done in the name of multisensory just aren't ones that research supports.
Thanks, Holly. And there are many more great questions, but because of time, we'll do our best to save them to the very end or answer via email. So don't worry, we are keeping track of questions.
All right, so we're going to take a short break now. Let's see, it is 10:13. I gabbed a little bit longer than I had intended to. So why don't we start back at 10:20. So if anybody needs a quick bio break, this is your opportunity, and we will come back and start at 10:20.
Feels good. Oh, baby. Well, I want to love you like I love a should. You're fine, so kind. Like to tell this world that you're mine, 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 mine. I keep my devil, man, I take on my tongue. but it sure is fun. Come on, baby, you drive me crazy. Goodness gracious, great balls of fire. Kiss me, baby. Feels good. Hold me, baby. Well, I want to love you like a lover should. You're fine, so kind. Like to tell this world that you're mine. Keep my notion and I'll bring on my thumbs. I feel nervous, but it sure is fun. Come on, baby, you drive me crazy. Goodness gracious, great balls of fire. Danger, will you be my darling dear? Love you all the time. I'm just a fool in love with you. An angel, the one I adore. Love you forever and evermore. I'm just a fool in love with you. I fell for you, and I knew the vision of your loveliness. I hope and I pray that someday I'll be the vision of your happiness. Oh, earth angel, earth angel. Wow. Please be my darling dear. Love you all the time. I'm just a fool
right, welcome back. Hope everyone had a chance to stretch or take care of other necessities. We are going to jump right into our second part and get started on actually getting some strategies to address some of the things we've talked about. I did have a chance to scan the chat and the Q&A a little bit during the break, and we will do our very best to leave some time at the end to answer those questions. If there's any question that you don't get answered, you feel free to email it. We'll put up that slide at the end again that has the UFLI email address, and I'm sure it's also being posted in the chat. So feel free to send us an email if you have a question about any of this. We will be happy to reply, but we will do our best to get to all the questions at the very end. Some of the questions may actually be answered in this next section though. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so just to take you back a little bit to the UFLI website, I want to point this out mostly because I'm going to be referring to some of the other resources on here during the second portion. So when you click on the resources section, we already talked about the Dyslexia Resource Hub, but we also have a Parent Resource Hub. You can see there's different things about kids all the way from birth through high school, resources for parents related to all of these. And then the Virtual Teaching Resource Hub. The Virtual Hub has all sorts of information and lots of resources that you can download for free. We designed this initially for virtual teaching, but there's a lot of information. There's a lot of strategies that can be directly applied in the classroom. So everything that's on there can be used either remotely or face-to-face. The hub has 4 main sections to it: the lesson structure, instructional activities, managing attention and behavior for reading instruction, and then just tech tools and tips for doing virtual teaching. Most of the work that we're going to be talking about is going to be coming under the instructional activities tab there. So back to the theory that got us kind of talking about this, the simple view of reading. We talked about how reading comprehension is the product of decoding and linguistic comprehension. And we talked about how the vast majority of difficulties happen on the decoding side. And so this portion of the presentation, we're going to really dig deep into the decoding side and give you some strategies that you can help kids who are struggling. From the rope perspective, it's this whole word recognition portion, but really focusing on the decoding aspect of it. So to get us started, I want to tell you a little bit about another theory that is also extremely thoroughly tested. There's tons of research that supports this theory as being a pretty accurate depiction of how word recognition develops over time. And this theory was developed by a researcher named Linnea Airy. If you are not familiar with her work, she's just brilliant. And she created this way of thinking about word reading through literally hundreds of studies of how kids acquire word reading skills. And so she refers to this as phases. And I think that part she very specifically chose the word phase, because the way that she talks about it is that these phases of development overlap. And instead of thinking about them as stages of development, stages are more like you do this and then you stop doing that and you start doing these things. She talks about these things as overlapping. You might still be using things from the previous phase, or even more than 2 phases away as you're developing until you get to the point of proficiency. I also want to point out that typically in most of the writing that she has done about these phases, she talks about 4 phases, but in a couple of chapters and articles, she talks about 5 phases. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little bit about the 5th phase as well, just so that you have the whole picture. So the first phase in development in word reading, Airy calls the pre-alphabetic phase. This is the phase that's demonstrated when you're riding down the road and your 3-year-old looks out the window and sees this and says, "Oh, McDonald's, let's stop and get a Happy Meal." And you're just thrilled and say, "Oh my goodness, my baby can read," right? But you know that your baby's not really reading the word McDonald's. Your baby is associating this logo with meaning. And that's a really typical early stage. And it doesn't matter what logo, there's tons of logos out there that kids will recognize as some things like, ooh, I like that, or ooh, I don't like that. And they will be able to say what that is for. But there have been studies where the word was changed to a completely unrelated word, and the kids still recognized it as what the logo typically represents. So in this phase, kids are looking at visual cues and guessing something based on that, attaching that visual cue with meaning. And so that's just an early way to think about how initial connection of symbols and meanings happen. So at this point, kids tend to over-rely on things that aren't related. One of the studies that was related to understanding this phase was actually kind of an accident. It started out as an accident. The researchers were attempting to teach very young children, I think 3-year-olds, a set of consonant vowel consonant words. And it turned out that all of the kids learned one particular word much faster than they learned the other word. And they couldn't figure out what made that word easier until one of them noticed that the card with that word on it had a thumbprint in the corner, just a faint thumbprint. But all of the kids noticed it, and all of the kids connected that thumbprint with whatever word they were being drilled on. And so to test out to see if that really was the reason, they replicated that thumbprint on a different word card. Every single child saw the new word card and said the previous thumbprint word. They then took a blank card and replicated the thumbprint and held it up. And half the kids said the first thumbprint word card on the blank card. So what that's telling us is that kids will use visual cues that are even irrelevant to figure out what a word is when they're first starting to read. Then kids start learning letters and sounds, and they move into what's called the partial alphabetic phase. And this is where they start to overgeneralize. They'll notice the beginning letter, sometimes the ending letter, but hardly ever the medial letters in a word. So maybe one time they were reading something where P was the word puppy. Now, anytime they see a word that begins with P, they'll say, oh, is that puppy? And even if it's, popcorn, something long, they will still cue into that one part. And so they're attending to letters and sounds, but not very skillfully yet. Then they move into the point where they actually are attending to every letter in the word, the full alphabetic phase. They see cat and they say k, at, and they come up with the word. Okay, that attention to every letter in the word, letter by letter decoding, is skilled reading, right? The full alphabetic phase is where we consider kids to be able to decode. And so in the primary grades, this is where we want all kids to get really by about the end of first grade, where they can decode a word. Now, they may not be able to decode multisyllabic words this way, but they could decode any simple consonant vowel consonant word, or even words with multiple consonants at the beginning or end, and come up with the correct decoding of that word. After kids get proficient with letter by letter decoding, then they start to notice chunks. And we call this the consolidated alphabetic phase, where maybe they've noticed this pattern SPL before, or they've noticed this pattern SASH before. And they start to chunk those patterns, and they notice these patterns enough that they can very quickly decode the word without saying s, p, l, a, sh. Right? They notice chunks at a time. And this is what's considered a more mature level of decoding skill. And then the fifth phase that I said before, Ari doesn't always describe this. Usually she'll just talk about these 4 phases that I've mentioned. The fifth phase is what you all as adult proficient readers have reached, the automatic phase, where word reading is so instantaneous, you don't have to think about it. And you are just recognizing words by sight because you've had enough exposure to either the whole word or the chunks within the words. So I'm going to pull up text, and I want you just to look at it and see if you can read it pretty much as quickly as the text comes up. Okay, go. Were you able to keep up and read it just about as quickly as the words came up? Probably. As adult proficient readers, you should be able to move through text pretty much that quickly. And like I said, this is the fifth phase that isn't always mentioned in explanations of various phases. But all of this is important for early word reading development. So we talked earlier about automaticity and this idea that less fluent readers, it uses more of their working memory capacity or more of their cognitive load to get through the text. And when kids become more proficient at word reading, they can devote more of their working memory capacity to comprehension. So automaticity with getting through words, so you've got to get accurate, and then you develop automaticity. And that's what allows you to then read text fluently and be able to comprehend it. Excuse me. So a little bit about how kids learn to read little words before we get into the actual strategies. Kids need to have alphabet knowledge. They need to know the letters and the sounds associated with them. They need to have phonemic awareness. They need to have decoding skills, and they need to have encoding skills. So we'll talk a little bit about each of those. Alphabet knowledge, there's a lot to know about a letter. If I show you this letter, I can ask you, what letter is this? You can name it. So knowing the letter's name is one element of alphabet knowledge. But what if I showed you a bunch of letters and asked you which one is the A? You would have to recognize the shape of the letter and say, that one, that's the one. Also, I might ask you, what sound does this letter make? And you might know the short sound, you might know the short sound and the long sound, you might know the short, long, and other variant sounds of A. So how much do you know about the sound associated with this grapheme? And then finally, the form. Do you know how to make this on your own, how to write it? So do you know where to begin, which direction to move, and where to end up? All of those are elements of knowing a letter. So when you're learning letter sounds, you also want to know where in the word is this letter most likely to be found. And so when you're introducing letter sounds, it's really helpful to say, well, this is one that you're only ever going to see in the middle of a word, or you can see this one at the beginning or middle, or you're going to see this in the beginning or end, but probably not in the middle. Helping kids understand the placement of letter sounds can be really helpful in understanding how to use their letter sounds for decoding. So on the virtual teaching resource hub, we actually have grapheme introduction slides, and you can download these to use in your classroom or remotely that give you this information. So this one is for the grapheme SH, and it says, you know, the SH can be used at the beginning of a word, like in ship or shop. It can also be found at the end of a word, like in rush or wish, but you're not going to find an SH in the middle of a one-syllable word. And so there's also words under these boxes that you can practice with, helping kids decode using that grapheme. So when we're talking about letter formation, there's a lot of things to understand about letter formation, and there's a lot of benefits to it. So what we see is that a lot of kids have never been taught how to properly form letters, and you can usually tell that because the natural way for a child to attempt to form a letter is to start at the bottom, to start at the baseline and go up. And there is no letter that is properly formed that way. And what I mean by proper formation is knowing where to begin, which direction to move, and where to end up. I don't really care about how pretty it is. I'm concerned about the process, not the product. But pretty much every handwriting program, even if the letter styles are slightly different, they all start in pretty much the same place, move in the same direction, and end up in the same place. So those are well established for efficiency. of writing. If you form your letters from the bottom, you aren't going to be able to write very fluently. But if you form them from starting at the correct spot and moving in the right direction, you can write more fluently. So learning correct letter formation has several benefits. It promotes alphabet knowledge. If I know how to form the letter, I'm better able to recognize that letter and associate the sound with it. It also facilitates writing fluency, so I can write more quickly if I form the letters efficiently. But what's really cool about it is that it also improves quality of written expression. Kids who form letters incorrectly tend to write more slowly, and that they tend to use more of their cognitive load devoted to letter formation and less of it devoted to what is the message I'm trying to convey. So that's one of the kind of cool artifacts, is that becoming fluent with writing letters actually improves your writing. Some of the things that kids need to learn are how to form circles and curves, how to form vertical and horizontal lines, and then the hardest one, how to form slanted lines. They also need to learn how to form both uppercase and lowercase letters. Uppercase tend to be easier, even though they're less commonly used in print. They tend to be easier because they are more different from one another. And a lot of the lowercase letters are just small versions of the uppercase letters. So it's easy to teach lowercase if they have some knowledge of uppercase letters. But it's something important that if you're teaching pre-K or kindergarten or even first grade, to have as part of your reading instruction, letter formation. Phonemic awareness is another critically important part. We talked about it being both the processing of sounds and also understanding how those sounds are produced. So the physical act of producing the sounds. So understanding articulatory gestures or sound production is a critical piece of this. So each of these sounds that is being produced here is identifiable. We already talked about the lips together, and this one, the one on the far right, that's your teeth touching your bottom lip. Think about that and what sounds can be produced that way. There are only two, one with your vocal cords vibrating and one without. There's and okay, only two sounds can be produced that way. Vowel sounds are trickier. When we're producing consonant sounds, one part of our articulatory, our vocal tract touches another part, one articulator touches another one, and those are easy to detect. With vowels, it's just all about how open or stretched out or rounded our lips are, and how tense or lax our cheeks and tongue are, and where the tongue is placed. So there's not a this part touching this part action with vowels, which is what makes vowels trickier for kids. It's harder to feel the difference, so it's harder for them to process the phonemic information. We have a resource that's another important element of learning sounds, is learning how to make sounds that are blendable. And so this is a video that demonstrates just the most common sound for each letter of the alphabet and how to produce it in a blendable way. And this sounds like a really obvious thing, but I'm really convinced that a lot of teachers haven't thought about how blendable their sounds are just by the way that they produce it. Some of the more obvious ones are saying, ba and ga. And when I try to read a word like big, I'll say ba-iga, right? That's not blendable. I can't blend those sounds together. But some of the less obvious ones are saying things like w or y. Those are not the sounds that W and Y make. When I say a word like wish, I don't say what-ish. I say wish, wish. So teaching the sound W is as opposed to w is much more effective at helping kids learn how to read. So thinking about blendable sounds is an important element of this. So this video can be a good resource for that. There's also ways to teach sounds where you are connecting the place and manner of articulation and teaching kids about this. So sound walls have become a very popular way of doing this. And a lot of teachers are taking down their word walls instead of classifying words by their first letter, which is often very uninformative for kids. They're classifying words by their sounds and using the articulatory gesture as a way to teach that. Just thinking about how a particular sound is formed can help kids connect that sound with the appropriate graphemes. So the other elements that kids really need to understand are decoding and encoding. So decoding is translating print into speech, so seeing a word and saying the word that's associated with that. This skill requires kids to blend phonemes together. So phonemic blending is important for decoding. When we're talking about encoding, we're talking about translating speech into print. So I say a word, I have to segment that word in order to spell it. So decoding is reading words, encoding is spelling words. They're both very important, and teaching them together makes a tremendous difference in promoting both areas. If you're teaching them together, then both reading and spelling gets better a lot faster than teaching them separately. The other element that I mentioned earlier is orthographic mapping. And the idea here is that we are using this process helps us understand how kids learn to read words by sight, because they have connected the phonemes and graphemes reliably to the point where those words are now secured in their memory. So for encoding, this is saying a word like frog. If I want to spell that, I'll say the word frog, and I'll think, what are the parts I hear to frog? F, r, ah, g. Okay, what letter says F? I mean, it says F. What letter says R? R. What says A? O. What says G? G. Okay, that's orthographic mapping. That's the mental process that happens when I go from saying a word to spelling it on paper. If I want to decode the word, I'll see the word in print and I'll say, let me connect the sounds with this. F is F, R is R, O is ah, G is G. Let me blend those sounds together and I'll say the word frog. Okay, this works when it's letter by letter decoding like this, where there's a one-to-one correspondence between letters and sounds. It also works when there are more than one letter combined to make a single sound. Like in fish, you have the digraph SH representing the sh sound, 4 letters, but only 3 sounds. It also works when I have an irregular word. So I can decode a word like said or encode a word like said by connecting, well, gosh, the s and the d are spelled exactly like I would expect them to be. It's only the eh in said that is spelled differently. And I can connect the AI in said as an unusual phoneme grapheme correspondence to be able to remember how to spell and how to read the word said. It's not that I have to memorize the whole word said. I just need to remember in the word said, it's an AI that spells that eh, or that AI is pronounced eh, if I'm decoding it. So I'm going to actually turn it over to Valentina for a moment to tell us a little bit about how we can apply this in learning to read little words. So Valentina, are you ready to go?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for waiting.
And I'm going to try to give Valentina remote control. We'll see if this works.
Thank you, Holly. And my dog happened to start barking right at this moment, but I'm hoping she stops soon. So I have the pleasure of talking to you this morning a little bit more about specific practices we can use to teach students to read little words. So one of the first things we wanted to talk more about today is Okonon boxes. So one of the earliest researchers that linked phonemic awareness to reading development was D.B. Okonon back in the 60s. So this Russian psychologist intended Okonon boxes or sound boxes to be used initially with chips. So the idea is that students would identify the picture on the card, such as key, and then segment each phoneme using chips. So for key, it would be k, E. And then for cat, segmenting each phoneme would be k, a, t. And then for frog, r, a, g. As you can see, since we are focused on segmenting individual phonemes, this consonant blend in frog is separated into 2 individual boxes. So Okonon boxes really help students focus on these phoneme level skills, so individual sounds in words. And we can use Okonon boxes to incorporate letters early in our reading instruction. As you can see here with these examples. Again, as you can see with frog, that consonant blend is segmented into 2 individual boxes. So Okonon boxes are really, really effective in improving phonemic awareness. So they help students be able to segment each individual sound they hear in a word. They also help promote students' phonemic segmentation for this reason. And phonemic segmentation is a really important skill for encoding or spelling. In order for students to spell words, they need to be able to hear each individual sound in order to represent each of those sounds or phonemes with the letters or letter combinations that make those sounds. So more recently, researchers and scholars have been talking about the importance of adding letters to this method. So including letters allows you, again, to continue supporting that phonemic awareness, but allows you to do some other things, including improving students' understanding of the alphabetic principle. So once again, that phonemes have corresponding graphemes, so letters or letter combinations. It promotes orthographic mapping that Holly just discussed, and it really gives students much more opportunity to practice their decoding skills. Even though the strategy is to support with encoding, by having repeated opportunities to see the letters, students also have repeated opportunities to then read the words. So at UFLI, we have some specific steps that we use to help our students use Okonon boxes in instruction. So the first step we do is count the sounds in the word with the child. So this allows the student to really understand that they are in control of identifying how many sounds or phonemes are in the word. So the first step is for the student to say the word like this, fish, and then count each phoneme in the word. So they would count I, sh, and as the teacher, you would do it with them and make sure that you're going left to right so that they can also see it left to right. After they've identified that the word fish has 3 sounds, then we help students draw 1 box for each sound or phoneme. So as you're drawing the boxes, it's also helpful to repeat the sounds 1 more time so students have that opportunity to hear that word segmented like this. I, sh. So saying those sounds really clearly and in a blendable way. And then at first, you can use chips to just focus on the phonemic aspect of it. So once again, as we're moving each chip into each box, we're saying the sounds yet again. I, sh. And then you can say the sounds 1 more time as you move the chips out for the student to hear it yet again. I, sh. And then as we just mentioned, inserting letters early. So not stopping there, but as soon as students know the phoneme graphing correspondences, we can add those in as well. So of course, because students need this type of practice within their intervention, you can't just give them the boxes and say, okay, here you go, write the word. It's a very scaffolded process where you help the student recognize the sound they hear and then match that sound with the letter or letters that match that sound. So an example would be, okay, what's the first sound you hear in fish? And the student would say, and then you would prompt, okay, what letter makes that sound? And they'd say F, and they would write it in. And you would repeat that process with what's the next sound you hear? I, good, what letter makes that sound? I, go ahead and put it in, and so on. As you can see, by inserting the letters in the boxes, it also provides a really great opportunity for the student now to decode this word and be able to decode it by saying each sound. Ish, fish. Once the student has inserted the letters and read the word, now they can write the whole word underneath, so they see it as a whole word, as a real word, not a word that goes in boxes. And then you can encourage students to say the sounds yet again as they spell the word fish. And guess what? You can give them another opportunity to read the complete word one last time. So as you can see from our steps and our very quick modeling, this activity really provides students with a lot of repeated opportunities to practice both encoding and then decoding of the word fish. So we also wanted to talk a little bit about manipulative letters before we talk about specific tools we have on the hub for you. So manipulative letters allow students to be able to have concrete objects like they do in math for manipulatives to, again, encode and decode words. So how we use manipulative letters, we always begin with a target word such as sip. So I would show my student, I'm spelling sip. And then what I say prompts the student to either encode or decode a word. So if I say change sip to lip, the student has to look at sip, and recognize that the s is what they need to change and that they need to add an o to spell lip. And then I can make a change to prompt the student to decode a new word. So I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to add an F in front. What's the new word we have? And the student reads flip. So that's an opportunity for them to decode this new word. And then instructions or prompts can become a little bit more difficult. So if we have flip, what do I need to change to make flop? And the student would either manipulate it or tell you to move the I and add an O to spell the word flop. And so once they encode this new word, then I, again, can prompt them to change the O to an A and then read this new word that allows them to decode this new word, which is flap. And then even more challenging, students can also make changes at the end of the word, which is much more difficult to attend to a difference in the word. So if I said change flap to flag, students have to really hear each individual phoneme and listen to where the change is, which is at the end. And then they would change the P to a G to spell their last word, flag. As you can see, quick activity that allows, once again, lots of opportunities to both decode and encode words based on your prompting. This is a strategy that combines both practices. So as you can see, I have chips up top and then letters at the bottom. And these are pre-made boxes. And so the first step, just like we saw with Okunin boxes, would be to move a chip to represent each phoneme. So if our first word was maths, we would help students segment each sound. Math. And then after they've mapped just the sounds with chips, then they would move manipulative letters into the boxes to represent those sounds or phonemes with the corresponding letters. So what letter says good, and so on as they spell mat. Then we can ask students to change mat to mats. And so first they move the chip down to represent the ending sound in mats. And once they do that, they can move the letter that matches that sound. Now, if we ask students to change mats to cats, they would know to change just the beginning sound they hear, which is the to a k to spell cats. As you could see in this example, the chips stayed the same color, but if you really wanted to highlight that change in sound, you could also first prompt the students to take out the purple and add a different color to represent a change in that initial phoneme sound. So for manipulative letters, something that we wanted to discuss was as much as possible using lowercase letters of just one color. So of course, text that students are exposed to primarily is made up of lowercase letters. And the reason for one color is that students are just focused on the shape of these letters instead of any other familiar attributes like color. And this is particularly important for students in the pre-alphabetic or partial alphabetic phase. Another important thing is that, as you saw from my sip to lip example, we start with appropriate target words. So we begin with a word that allows us to make many other words from it. And so on this list, you see a lot of words that are regularly spelled, we would say. So these words allow us, again, to make many new words from them. Sip to lip, snack to smack, rain to pain. And so those are great examples of target words. The words on the right have a lot of irregularities in them. So as a teacher, whenever you look at a word and you're thinking, what makes what sound, those would not be good target words to use for manipulative letter work. So the examples on the left, good examples, and the examples on the right are not great examples to begin word work or manipulative letter work with. So we also always talk about these 3 rules of word work with manipulative letters. The first is that we can conduct word work at varying levels of difficulty. So we can do word work at the onset rhyme level, which is the easiest, where students are just changing the onset of the word. At the phoneme level, where students are changing any letter or group of letters in the word, so initial, medial, or final. And then we also have advanced pattern type of word work, where students have been introduced to more complex graphemes, like vowel teams or our control vowels, and those are incorporated into the word work. So our second rule is, again, that we want to help students both encode and decode new words. Word work is typically done where teachers say, change this word to this word to this word to this word. And so that type of activity only allows them to encode or spell new words. By providing different prompts, we can ensure that students are getting both types of practice. So by saying things like change mat to sat, once again, those are encoding or spelling changes. But if we say change the R in rat to an S, what word is this? That requires the student to read or decode the new word. So here are some more prompts for encoding practice. Again, change blank to blank, or by asking what letter do you need to change to make sat into hat? Or what would you have to do to change cat into cast? So again, that's a more complex kind of word work chain. For decoding, some of our prompts can be, again, change the S in sat to an H. What word do you have? You can also do this instead of using letter names, letter sounds. So change the S in sat to a what word do you have? Or read your new word. And then also, again, more complex changes, like if I put an S right here in cat, what word does that spell? So maybe the word would be scat or cat. And then our last rule is that we can use both real and nonsense words in our word work. So we want to use mainly real words because, once again, those are the words that students will come across in text more frequently or at all. But we can use nonsense words about every 8 to 10 real words. We like to use them in our word chains in order to help transition to words where we can't find an in-between word, but also to really assess whether students can apply those phonics and decoding skills. Make sure that when you are using nonsense words that students know that it's a silly or nonsense word. And then also for words that are real words but maybe unfamiliar, it's helpful to have a really brief explanation handy to provide for our students. So here is a video of myself with a student doing word work, different types of encoding and practice prompts.
Slapped. All right. Now I want you to, we're going to squeeze a P here in the middle. Let's read our new word. Splat. What? You're such a good reader. Like Splat the cat. That's right. We have the word splat. Can you make the word split? Listen to the sounds. What do you need to change? The A and the A. Good spelling. And what word do you have? Split. Split. Word.
Okay, so in that example, you saw that based on my prompts, the student either encoded or decoded a word. The other thing you saw me do with the student is because of the size of the letters, it's a really great way for students to practice segmenting and tracking under each grapheme or letter, and then sweeping to read the word. I also use that finger approach to help the student recognize where that change was when they were encoding the new word. This is something that could be done virtually if you are still teaching virtually or in a hybrid way. We will skip that video for now, but if you are interested in these types of videos, they are available on the Hub.
Peter, and you're gonna.
We do have a resource on the Hub that provides just a virtual version of manipulative letters that are on a slide. This is an option of larger manipulative letters that are used at a center or workstation where students are working on encoding and decoding with their peers to review previously taught concepts that have been targeted in the classroom. This can also be done with what we call a blending board, simply on a surface that's raised where you're using grapheme cards. This could also be done on the table with grapheme cards. Our word work mat, which is available on the Hub, is just a printable version that provides grapheme tiles that are hopefully attached with Velcro, which makes it a really handy tool for you as a teacher to have students be able to bring down this resource to the carpet or bring it to the teacher table. As you can see with our word work mat, the different graphemes are just separated by different types of concepts like consonant digraphs and art-controlled vowels. And then the alphabet on the right includes the little letters underneath them, so students know where to return the letters, which is important for the alphabet so that the letters stay in alphabetical order and students can quickly engage with word work activities in that way. Other great thing I love about the word work mat is that if students are beginning the year just with the alphabet, you can actually not include any of the other grapheme tiles and add them as they're being learned. So here's a quick video of us using the word work mat with a group of students who are just working on CVC words. So as you can see, the word work mat is folded so that all they can see is the alphabet.
Yes. How do we make the word wet? What do you need to change? Good job. Show me you're ready to read, Amy. Awesome job. Pointing underneath, showing me you're ready. Saying the sounds. Wet.
So in this example, you also saw us really reinforce that segmentation and that blending, and then helping them hear those sound changes when spelling a new word. Here are just pictures of this being used for intervention one-on-one with students. And we will skip those videos for right now. This word work mat can also be used really effectively in the classroom. And in this picture, you can see that the teacher actually has the word work mat being projected by using something like a ladybug or projector. And so students can check their encoding with what the teacher has on the screen. Again, just a really great way to provide all students with a way to engage in the instruction. So here's just a screenshot of all the different types of manipulative letters that we've discussed. Hopefully you have resources that you can use for this, but we do have available resources on the Hub, which Holly will talk about in just a minute. So just to recap before I hand it back to to Holly. Powerful word work really promotes phonemic awareness. So it really supports students' ability to hear different sounds in words, be able to blend and segment individual phonemes. It helps build their encoding skills. So it helps support them having opportunities to spell words with concepts they've learned, as well as decoding skills. As you could see from our examples, lots of opportunity for students to read the words they're spelling. And then of course, promotes orthographic mapping that helps students make a lot of these words go into their sight vocabulary. And so now I will hand it off back to Dr. Lane to finish our morning talking about planning for word work.
Thanks, Valentina. So when we're thinking about planning for word work, there's a lot of things to take into account. One of them is the scope and sequence. So you may have a solid scope and sequence with whatever reading curriculum that you have. I will say that not all curricula have a very good scope and sequence. So you want to look at it to see, does it follow a good progression. We do have a scope and sequence available on the Virtual Teaching Hub that lays things out in what we would consider a logical progression. And that's the most critical piece of that. You want to be systematic in how you approach the order of grapheme phoneme correspondences. We also want you to think about the idea of connected phonation versus segmented phonation. So just about a year ago, this study came out that illustrated something I had been suggesting to our pre-service teachers for years to take this kind of approach. And it was really gratifying to see, oh yeah, here's a study that actually supports exactly what we're talking about. And that is teaching the blending of sounds by using continuous sounds at the beginning of words. So what I mean by that is if I'm teaching at, if I connect those together, it's going to be easier to blend. So let's use the example sun, sun, as opposed to Now, in this case, for sat, mat, rat, all of those beginning sounds are what we call continuous sounds. And I can blend the initial sound right into the vowel. In the words bat, if I'm saying the sounds at, I can't blend it right into it as easily. Pat, cat, I have stop sounds at the beginning of all of those words. So what happens, and what this study told us, is that if we teach kids using those continuous sounds, they make the transfer when it comes time to blending the stop sounds. They can connect them more readily on their own. So it's not just that it makes them learn to blend sounds better, doing it that way, it does, but it also transfers to the blending of stop sounds. So we can't demonstrate that same process with a word like bat or pat, but if kids have learned sat, mat, then they're going to be able to do it when they come to those sounds. So that's just a kind of really refinement of this kind of decoding work, but it can make a really big difference for your kids. All right, and then the other part about planning for word work is using word chains and designing word chains that are going to be effective. So making a sequence of words that makes sense for this kind of practice. So Valentina shared you a couple of examples of those earlier, and we're just going to dig a little bit deeper into that. So a word chain is just a series of carefully chosen words that the sequence makes sense for encoding and decoding practice. So here's an example of a pretty long word chain where in each example, I'm just changing one phoneme to another word. So as opposed to changing a lot of different parts of the word. So you can use word work to do the different levels of difficulty that Valentina mentioned earlier. She talked about the onset rhyme level. And in this case, I'm just changing the initial sound, sit, bit, lit, hit, bit, wit, pit. I can also do a little bit more complex onset rhyme level by using consonant clusters at the beginning. So going from pit to spit, and then adding an L and going to split, and then taking out the P and saying slit, and then changing the L to a K to say skit. Those are a little bit more complex level of onset rhyme. The phoneme level, we're changing not just the initial position, but all of the initial, medial, and final positions. So going from hop to hip changes the medial, hip to hid changes the final sound, hid to lid changes the initial sound, and so on. But this can also be made a little bit more complex by doing other kind of more advanced changes. So those are the two most common levels. And then we have the more advanced levels where we're changing, in this case, different kinds of vowels and vowel teams. And we got to be really careful about this. So going from made to mad in this example, I have to think about what in the middle of that word is saying a, and take out both letters to change it to a, right? And in this case, making that connection is something that we need to be really explicit about. But again, we're only changing one position of the word at a time. So how do you actually use a word chain? You can use it in all of the different methods that Valentina was just sharing. So Elkonin boxes, manipulative letters, and blending boards. So within Elkonin boxes, we can take our Elkonin boxes and say, this is the word chain we want to use. So we spell fish using the procedure she described earlier, and then we can make changes. So what would I need to do to change fish to dish? Okay, what if I change the I in dish to an A? What word would I have? Okay, now change dash to bash. Okay, change the sh to a th. What word is that? Okay, so you can do all of those kinds of changes just within the Elkonin box work. With manipulative letters, this is the same kind of thing, right? You're just changing these words to demonstrate what, I'm changing individual letters to demonstrate these processes, right? Encoding and decoding along the way, but just with the carefully planned sequence of letters and words. And when we come to blending boards, we have the cards that Valentina mentioned earlier that we can plan out word chains for that, or we can use the virtual blending boards. So let's think about what makes a good word chain. Okay, so the key thing is that you're changing only one phoneme at a time. So a good example is changing, this is at the phoneme level, sit to pit, pit to pig, pig to dig, and so forth. A bad example is changing sit to sap. I'm changing both the medial and final position, changing too much at one time. So changing one phoneme at a time is an important element. Also, using only one pronunciation of a grapheme. So a lot of graphemes and phonemes have multiple different connections. So one grapheme might be pronounced in several different ways. One phoneme might be spelled in several different ways, and we just want to have one connection that we're using within the single word chain. So for example, going from good to hood to hook to look, that's a good example. Going from good to food, from food to hood, from hood to hoop, I'm still only changing a little piece of it, keeping the OO the same, but in these words, the pronunciation of OO changes from to oo, and I don't want to have those kinds of changes in the same chain. So when we're talking about these different levels, we also want to make sure that you can incorporate nonsense words, especially if that will help you transition. Sometimes it's hard to find a good transition from one real word to another real word to get the target phonemes that you're looking for, and throwing in a nonsense word can make that a little bit easier. But it's also good just for a little bit of additional practice. It kind of keeps kids on their toes. They definitely haven't seen those words before, so they're not going to be doing them from memory. So here's an example of a word chain that's been thought out with changing each one from encoding to decoding to encoding, just alternating between, but thinking through what are you going to say to make those alternating directions, go from an encoding direction to a decoding direction and back. So we also have a quick video about word chains and how they can be used in encoding and decoding practice. So we'll share that link for you. That's on the hub as well. So on the Virtual Teaching Hub, we have a variety of resources that can be used to support the kind of word work that we're talking about. So if you go onto the hub and you go into the instructional activities section, you'll find all of the different kinds of pieces here, and you want to click on the decoding and encoding. Okay, so this is the section of the hub that teaches the combination of phoneme grapheme correspondence knowledge into words. So reading words and spelling words. In that section, you'll see 4 different pieces. And there's also a little example of, this is an explanation of Aries phases that I started with, that will just kind of remind you of this. So if any of this, you need to review where we're trying to take kids, this will help you with that. But in the word work section here, this is where you'll find the links to our virtual apps that will help you with this encoding and decoding work. So you have the virtual blending board, and then you have 2 different versions of the word work mat. We've got the beginner level that has just the alphabet, and then the intermediate level, that's the one pictured at the bottom, that has the other graphemes as well. So depending on where you are with your teaching, you might choose the beginner or intermediate. Also, there's a link to a tool. This is not our tool. This is Devin Kearns from the University of Connecticut, developed this tool called Finder. And it's a great way to generate words to do practice with for these activities. So a little bit, just to show you what the virtual word work mats look like. This is Valentina doing a lesson virtually with a student.
Sounds, follow my arrow. Rob. Close. What letter is this? A neck. Rob. Good reading. Now I'm going to cover up this letter. Let's read this new word. Drop.
All right, so that just shows, you can see how some of it works. She just stacked the letters up on top of each other to make the change. The whole idea here is getting kids to practice this whole process of encoding and decoding words. Here's a little bit more advanced example with Kelly.
What word did you make?
Aren't.
Okay, close your eyes. I get to make the next one. Okay, open your eyes. What word did I make?
Oh, that's part.
Great reading. Okay, now can you help me turn part into park? Let's sound out the word park. Ready?
Park. Park.
Okay, you've got control. Go ahead and turn part into park.
Okay, so a couple things about this one. You may have seen that when she had the first word, she just kind of flung the letter off, that it'll disappear that way. So you don't have to stack it. You can do it either way. Also, she said, now you've got control. So if you're doing this on Zoom, you can give your student remote control, like I did with Valentina earlier when she was clicking through the slides. Zoom allows you to do that. Not all video conferencing platforms do that. If you're doing this in the classroom, if you've got a smart board, you can have kids come up and move the tiles themselves, or you can put it on tablets so that they can each have one and do the manipulation themselves. So here's an example of the word work chain being used with the word work mat. Same kind of chain that we were talking about before, but in this example. And so the teacher can be saying, read this word, or how would you change this word to this other word, to alternate between encoding and decoding skills. Okay, and then we have, we want to think about how these are used. So the word work mats are used to develop accuracy in both decoding and encoding. Okay, so accuracy as opposed to automaticity. So we're asking them to think through and process the information to spell these words or to read these words. For the word work mat, either the teacher or the student can manipulate the letters. The teacher or the student can also track under the letter. So you saw Valentina doing that and pointing out the sound that the student struggled with there. For the virtual blending board, this is a little bit different kind of app. The way this is organized, you can see there are initial sounds, medial sounds, and final sounds, and then also some final E and plural S additions there. And for the virtual blending board, what you're doing is just changing either the initial, medial, or final sound. And so in this example, the teacher's manipulating the board and the student is just decoding. They're not decoding and encoding. So the way that this looks here is Valentina.
Back.
Very good. How about now? You got it.
Black.
Good. How about now?
Black.
Yeah, black. You got it. And now?
So in this example, you can also see over here on the right, these words are appearing as they make them. So you can also go back and have the student read down the list. It just keeps the last 9 or 10 words up on the list. So you may also notice that some of these have grayed out letters, and all that is, you can still select those letters, but if you do select them, it will make a nonsense word, and it's just alerting you to that fact. So I could click and say DAC, change SAC to DAC, and have them decode that and include the nonsense word. It's just telling you that that's not a real word. Unfortunately, it will not filter out for you any profanity, so be careful about what you're clicking. But you can do those changes. You can also click on the blank, and that just means that that position in the word, the medial or final position, will be blank. So I could change SAC to ACK if I wanted to. Same thing if I wanted to add a silent E or an S, I could change it to SACS and then click off and remove the S. So here's the word chain being used with the blending board. So the same kind of idea, you can have a list of words, including real words and nonsense words, and your student is just decoding as you change it. And again, you can do this with the whole class, having that up on the screen, or you can have it be something that you're using virtual. So this one also, you may notice that there are some of the tiles have what we sometimes call consonant blends. And we don't typically teach blends as units, but the way that the app works, replacing a position in the word, the only way to include those combinations was to have them on a tile together, which is, again, another reason to not have the student doing the manipulation on the blending board. We want to do it so we can change and sequence the word so that we're only making a little bit of a change. You notice it went from naps to snaps, not from maps to snaps, right? Because I'm just changing that one phoneme in the word. All right, so the blending board, to reiterate, is used for decoding both accuracy and automaticity. So as kids get better at this, you can make changes pretty quickly and have those changes come up and see how automatically your student can decode the new word. The teacher does all the manipulation for the blending board. The student should not be manipulating. All of these graphemes there, to have the student try to find what they need is not a good idea. That's not a good use of their time, and it's probably, there's not really any learning benefit from doing it that way. This does require some advanced planning. you need to think through what concepts you're going to include. And on the app, you can choose which pictures appear. So you may have noticed on here, there were just a couple of letters showing. And then on here, there's a lot. And so the teacher chose all of those letters. So you can go into the app and pick which ones that you're looking for, which ones you're including. And we're working right now on setting it up so that you would be able to save your selections for future lessons. It's not set up that way. Right now, you have to choose the letters before each lesson and get all that picked out. But hopefully soon we'll have it set up so that you can go in and say, you know, group A has this set of letters, or group B, and or particular child has a set of letters for their lessons, and save those. So I'm actually, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the little demonstration, what we were hoping to do. But I think you get the basic idea for our virtual apps, and we hope that you go and explore them and try some of these things out. One other thing that I wanted to point out, if you have all of these graphing showing, this can be a little bit overwhelming for a beginning reader. So maybe that your student is ready to use all these different choices, but you don't want to have them all showing. If you're doing this remotely, you're using Zoom. Zoom has a really great feature in the advanced. If you choose advanced screen sharing options, you can select portion of screen and only share a portion. So on the teacher side, it will look like this. You can put this green rectangle around just the word. So this is the part of the screen that your students can see. They can't see all of the rest of it. So on their end, it just looks like that. So that's a good little alteration that you can use to use the blending board, where it's just, here's another word, and just changing one part at a time. It's really powerful that way. I wanted to share just a little bit about irregular words. This is not really the focus of what we're talking about today, but just to share what we have. I wanted to point out the idea that a regular word is a decodable word, and an irregular word is a word that can't be decoded, but for two reasons. That either the sounds of the letters are unique to that word or to just a few words. We would consider that one a permanently irregular word. Or it can be irregular because your student or your group of students has not yet learned the letter sound correspondences in that word. So in that case, it would be considered a temporarily irregular word. And you would treat them slightly differently. But in both cases, what we want to focus on is the fact that irregular words are usually mostly decodable. We talked about this with the orthographic mapping, just learning that said, the AI represents even with more complex words. It's an EO that says E in people, unusual, but it is a common word. The method that has actually become quite popular to do this is called the heart word method. And with this, what you do is you point out that the S has the sound we would expect. The D has the sound we would expect. D. It's the AI that we have to learn by heart, because that's not the sound we would expect it to have. And on the hub, we have some resources for using this heart word method for teaching irregular high frequency words. So in terms of learning to read big words, we also have a lot of resources on the hub. Kids need to learn all of the same things. They also need to learn about syllables and morphemes. And I'm just going to show you very quickly what we have on the hub for learning big words. You can use Elkonin boxes the same way, just using each syllable kind of like its own word. For lobster, we would have lob and then st-er, and fill it in just like you would for using small words, just having each word as, or each syllable as its own kind of segment or word. When you're teaching about syllables, we have some slides on the hub that will help you teach, terminology, syllable types, and syllable division patterns. That's on the big word section of the hub. And these slides right here you can download and use them. It helps you teach what is a vowel, the idea of voiced and unvoiced, what is a consonant, how you're using different parts of your mouth to make them, consonant sounds can be voiced or unvoiced. And then what is a syllable? It gives you some definitions that you can use, some practice in segmenting the syllables in a word, some resources for teaching syllable types. We recommend teaching open and closed syllables because those make up almost 75% of all the syllables in English words, so they're worth teaching. Open syllables have a long vowel and closed syllables have a short vowel. So knowing those two syllable types is really helpful. We also recommend teaching final stable syllables. These are the syllables at the end of a word that are always pronounced the same way. So learning those as units makes a lot of sense. The other syllable types, if you've done a good job in teaching these patterns as single syllable words, really don't need to be addressed separately as syllable types. If you do address them separately, you might teach them together. I tend to skip those altogether. If kids know open and closed and final stable syllables, that's usually plenty. For teaching open and closed syllables, there's explanations and then also demonstrations of how you can close a syllable to change the pronunciation. She, shed is always the kid's favorite example there. There's example words that you can practice. Final stable syllables, we have the consonant LE pattern. And then we've got the other final stable. These are just words that are are syllables that are at the end of a word that are always pronounced the same way, like your shun and your chur kinds of syllables. And then there's explanations of the other syllable types as well. And I'm sorry I'm going through this part really quickly, but we are pretty much out of time. And I wanted to get through to the end of this so that we can answer any questions and also allow you to get to the evaluation and certificate for attendance. The other piece of this that we also have information on the hub about is morphemes. And this is simply the smallest unit of meaning in a word. And there's a lot to know about morphemes. There is a explanation of how to read big words that has all of this terminology in it that is on the hub, along with our glossary that will help define these terms for you. And I just I'm clicking through to get to the part that we can, I'll show you the resources that we have. So there are morpheme trees like this where you have the root on the root of the tree, and then the definition on the trunk of the tree, and then it branches out into all the different ways that you can form these words. So these are on there for a lot of the common Latin roots. And then we also have morpheme matrices where you have prefixes and suffixes that you can combine with the root to make different words. And so these are also available for you on the hub in the big word section. And along with that explanation that I mentioned. The other important point that I wanted to point out here is the idea of flexibility in pronunciation and the idea of set for variability. This is the mental flexibility that kids have and that you can help develop by teaching them how to listen to a vowel and change it to another pronunciation. Because instead of just guessing from context where we're not very accurate, if you're using this set for variability along with your decoding skills, you can be a lot more accurate in reading these bigger words. So if they've just read the word wasp, and then they're thinking about the context of it, they can probably get to wasp. If they read island, and then they hear, I was stranded on a desert island, oh, now they can figure out it's island. Or if they read tree sure, and then they say, I found some buried tree sure, oh, that must be treasure. And they can figure out the correct pronunciation. That flexibility and pronunciation is really powerful. And that's a really important thing to develop as your kids move into longer words. One way to do that is to teach them to pronounce all of the vowels as schwa sounds, or to shift the stress of a syllable from one to another. Those strategies, though, only work if the word they're trying to read is part of their oral vocabulary. If I say complicate and I don't know the word complicate, then I probably will never figure out what that word is. On the hub, we also have word cards and lists to practice these different grapheme phoneme correspondences. And we've got a variety of games and printables that you can download in order to provide more practice. So I'm going to stop us there and jump to our questions. I will direct you though to the lesson structure section where we've got great guidance for planning activities over the course of the week. We just didn't leave enough time to talk about all this in depth. But these lesson planning guides are in the lesson structure section of the hub and can be very powerful resources for you. So we're going to stop and take questions. And I also want to direct you, you can use these QR codes or the links. I think they're probably in the chat as well to evaluate this very rushed session here and to get your certificate of participation. But I will stop sharing in just a moment and take questions. So
Holly, before we begin the questions, folks, we invite you to stay with us. We'll stay as long as we need to. I know I could listen to Holly for hours and days on end. And Holly, just on behalf of everyone who participated, amazing job. Just you and your team and Valentina and Mindy and Kelly, just amazing. And the resources that you've put together with the UFLI initiative are second to none. We are so glad that we had so many people with us. We are going to be posting the recording on our fiddlers.org website within 2 weeks. And there were so many questions back and forth in the chat. I'm thinking maybe we could just send that out to the people who registered, that they could go back through that. But I also saw that Kelly and Valentina were typing in links and PDF documents and all that as well. So we will follow up with you as we can, but we're going to be quiet now. You have the session evaluation and the certificate of participation up there on the screen. I'm also putting it back in the chat again for you. And we're going to turn it back to Dr. Lane for Q&A. Thank you again, Holly. Fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much for your kind words. So yeah, we just want to stick around for a few minutes and answer any other questions that you may have. And Valentina or Kelly, can one of you share whatever questions came up?
Sure, Holly, we've been able to answer a lot of the questions within the chat, and like it was mentioned, we could provide some of those responses to everyone as well. There was one lingering question related to multisensory instruction. So it asked, would you say that we all are thinking is multisensory instruction is more geared to learning styles? Like I learn better if I see things and I am able to move. I think providing multiple ways of learning has validity to help students learn. It just may not be the best way to teaching reading, ?
So great question. So the idea of learning styles is a tricky one. And first of all, they're learning styles and multisensory instruction is not the same thing. The idea with learning style is that you would assess and find out what is a child's preferred learning style and teach to that style. With multisensory, you are incorporating multiple senses at the same time. So first of all, let me clarify what the research says. Learning styles, there's a lot of research that tells us that they actually don't exist. We have preferences that I might want to see something visually presented. You might want to hear it presented, but it doesn't actually make a difference in our learning. There's a lot of research that has tested this to show that if we match learning style and teaching presentation, it doesn't help learning. So this whole concept of learning styles is one that we want to try to debunk. It's not something that exists. It's not something that actually does support. Now, the idea of multisensory learning, where I take in multiple things at once, actually does have support. And the articulatory gestures are one of the things that makes it work, because the articulatory gestures, that kind of multisensory input is actually related to the concept, as opposed to, doing something on, clapping out syllables in a word. That's not related to understanding the concept in the same way. So there are some things multisensory that actually are related to the concept that you're trying to learn, and that those things make a difference in incorporating those. The things that are not related to the thing that you're trying to learn don't seem to make a difference there. So I hope that explained it. But yeah, Valentina put in this TED Talk. I think it's a really, if you're questioning this idea of whether learning styles exist, this TED Talk is a really good one to help understand why it's not an accurate thing. It's a very popular assumption, just like, you know, reversals are a piece of dyslexia. You know, that's just as common of a misconception. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Holly. There have been a lot of questions about our resources and whether the team was considering having some examples and resources for secondary level, especially because of the best intervention standards for grades 6 through 12. So if you could talk a little bit about any kind of efforts in that area.
Yeah, so the things that I shared toward the end that I kind of rushed through, unfortunately, with reading big words is one of the critical pieces that connects with the secondary. Foundational skills are foundational skills, no matter what age the student is. So you can have a 10th or 11th grader who still needs basic grapheme, phoneme, correspondence instruction. So some of the things that Valentina talked about in the little word section of that. But more often than not, secondary reading intervention programs are going to focus more on reading multisyllabic words. So the syllable kind of information and the morphemes in particular. Morphemes are really powerful because they go beyond just decoding. Morphemes can help with decoding, but they can also help with meaning and understanding the word itself and what it means as part of the text. So, and it can help with spelling, understanding what the meaning of a word is, or the meaning of a morpheme is, like it's this, that rather than that, can help us choose how to spell it as well, if we know it's related to a word. So for example, knowing that the words heal and health are related, that they both share that heal root, that helps us understand to spell health with an EA in it. So knowing that connection can make a difference even for spelling. So that piece of it is, I think, one of the more important sections. Part of understanding morphemes also relates to understanding word origins, which we didn't even get into that at all. But understanding whether a word originates from Anglo-Saxon or Latin or Greek can also make a difference in how you are connecting. So that's just a little bit of the information related to the secondary foundational standards, but those are some of the most important ones.
Thanks, Holly. Before I continue asking questions, I wanted to mention that a lot of people have provided great feedback and have asked about continuing webinars. And so we have put the link to the UFLI Facebook page in the chat. That's a great place to get updates on new resources that we add on our website, as well as any either free or paid professional development opportunities through partnership with UFLI. So I wanted to mention that. There was
can I interject there? Also on the virtual teaching hub, there's a link to our webinar series that we did on virtual teaching. And some of that is, or actually most of it actually also applies to teaching face-to-face as well. So a lot of this content or connected content is presented in some of those. So the part that I kind of rushed through with all the syllable and morpheme stuff, there's a whole webinar, an hour-long webinar on Spotlight on grades 3 through 5. So you might want to check that out. It's geared toward virtual teaching, but it doesn't have to apply just to virtual teaching.
That's right. And Kelly just pasted the link to the webinars in the chat. So just a few more lingering questions. And thank you to the 340 participants that are sticking around with us. So a participant asked, is there merit in teaching students word families based on teaching students to recognize onset and rhymes?
So yeah, that's a great question. So what I typically see in terms of word family instruction is really at the wrong place in students' development. And that is that it's often something that's taught very early on. And when we're doing initial word work with encoding and decoding, changing just the onset is a good strategy. But it's not that we're teaching that rhyme, it's that we're teaching how changing the onset changes the word. So we can change from, go from, sat family to the sit family, or the it family, from at to it. And it would be considered a different word family. But what we're really focused on is what the difference that onset makes in creating a word. And we want to get kids into that phoneme level work as soon as possible. And most kids don't need a whole lot of time just doing onset rhyme level changes. Now, once kids are moving from, they're solidly in that full alphabetic phase, we want to get them to start to notice chunks to get into the consolidated alphabetic phase. So at that point, pointing out not just word families like we think of them in the traditional sense, but other patterns. So remember the example I shared was splash, noticing that, that SPL consonant cluster is a pattern that we see. We wouldn't see SDL, for example. That's not a pattern that we see in English, but SPL is one that we do see. So being familiar with that as a possible sequence of letters is helpful. Noticing that word family, ASH, to be able to go from, lash to splash to bash to sash, and having different chunks where we're connecting that ASH is helpful. But it's a little bit later in the sequence than we normally see it.
Thanks, Holly. That was really helpful. I hope it was helpful to the participant who asked that question. And we have one last question left in the Q&A. It's related to dysgraphia. So we talked about dyslexia in the brain. Could you talk a little bit about dysgraphia or any resources that you could point participants to?
That's a really great question too. So that's basically a whole nother session about dysgraphia. But just so that to make it clear, these two things are typically connected. It's rare that you have a child who just has dysgraphia who doesn't also have dyslexia. They do exist, but it's more common that those two things appear together. And the dysgraphia can also actually be defined in several ways. It's most often defined as an issue with actual motor skills, but it can be anything to do with writing. So problems with forming letters, problems with spelling words, problems with written expression. So depending on how you're defining dysgraphia and understanding that it can be any of those, if it's just a motor problem, then it may not be connected with dyslexia. But if it's a problem with spelling or organizing written expression, then it may very well likely be. So a lot of the same kinds of strategies apply. As far as what the brain activation patterns are for kids with and without dysgraphia, I honestly don't know. I don't know that we have a lot of research in that. It's not something that I've really looked for, but now I'm going to probably go searching for it because that's a really great thing to wonder about. But given that there's so much overlap with dyslexia, I imagine that there's going to be a lot of the same kinds of issues with brain activation patterns. So you may have reached a limit of my knowledge in that regard. So,
and we are going to paste the UFLI email in the chat one last time in case you do have follow-up questions. Feel free to email them to our UFLI email, and we can forward to Holly or to other team members who may be able to help answer any of your lingering questions. And thanks again for sticking around past the time for our Q&A.
Thank you so much, Valentina. I appreciate everything that you contributed as well. Holly, you know how we feel about you, and Mindy and Kelly working in the back there. Also remember, your local Fiddler Center has a reading expert on staff, and they are familiar with the UFLI site, and so they can help you navigate that if you have some follow-up questions. We also want to give a big shout out to Jessica, our closed captioner, whose fingers have been going a mile a minute to make sure that our information was accessible to everyone. So thank you so much, Jessica. So one more time, thank you, Kelly, for placing the evaluation and the certificate of participation in the chat. We are hoping to have the recording posted to our website within 2 weeks, so you'll be able to have access to it then. And just to have you in our own state, in our own backyard, whether you like Gators or Seminoles, it does not matter, because when it comes to reading and all the information that was shared, you folks are truly the tops. Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank you so
everybody,
much.
for participating. Take care and let us know if we can be of assistance. Stay well.
Thank you so much. And go Gators.
Go Steelers. Okay, Mindy, you'll have to stop the recording before we started doing our football terms. Another Steeler fan. Thank you, JSP.